I go ahead and do that. What we'd also welcome and would like to give you the opportunity, if you could all find the chat feature on your Zoom applications, and if you could, just as I'm introducing everybody on our side, if you would take an opportunity to introduce yourself and perhaps a neighborhood or association or organization that you may have affiliation with that you're enjoying tonight's presentation on behalf of. So tonight, I want to recognize first Laura Harmon, who is our UDO project manager. We've got several staff members of both the UDI and the core team members working on subdivision, streets, and infrastructure as part of the Unified Development Ordinance. We've got Tracy Newsom, Felix Obergron, and Julian Burton of Charlotte Department of Transportation. We also have Josh Weaver, our subdivision administrator. We have John Howard joining us from Charlotte Area Transit. And then the other teammates that I have on the UDO team, we have Mariah Wozniak, Yolanda Jones, Katie Burkett, and Sandra Montgomery. And we also have another UDO SSI core team member, Robbie Zink, with land development with the city of Charlotte. So that's all of us on this side. Again, I've seen some of you have entered some comments in chat to introduce yourself. Very much appreciate that. With that, give me 1 second. I'll get my screen shared and get our presentation going. Very good. Can I get a thumbs up if we see the presentation? Awesome. Thank you all. So once again, welcome to this evening's conversation on the UDO, concentrating on SSI and the required new streets improvements and associated standards for them. The flow for this evening is staff will present and narrate a presentation. During this presentation, we'd welcome you in real time to please enter any comments, questions, or concerns that you may have in the chat box, which some of you may have already interacted with. We've got subject matter experts joining us this evening that, as the presentation continues, we'll try to respond to those in real time. If for whatever reason we happen to miss something in real time, we'll have an opportunity at the end to circle back and revisit some of those that we may have missed and provide responses or discuss. So the purpose for the meeting this evening, as I said, is to discuss some required new streets and improvements concepts and the standards for them as included in the first draft of the Unified Development Ordinance. And specifically, we're hoping that out of this, you can learn when or if development triggers new or improved streetscape, learn where you may find the standards for these new or improved features and how they are built and look in the physical environment. And then lastly, learn a little bit about the process of how development may mitigate transportation impacts in and around projects. Some of you may be familiar if you've attended some of our previous sessions of kind of the key dates for the Unified Development Ordinance. So this may be familiar to you, excuse me. But I do want to point out a couple of things because we had some late breaking developments as of the council meeting yesterday. Specifically concerning our public engagement efforts and the acceptance of public comments with this first draft of the Unified Development Ordinance. Again, we released the first draft in October of 2021. We were engaged in public comment or continue to be engaged in, public engagement and accepting comments on that first draft from October until we had an initial deadline of the middle of this month, January, but that has now been extended an additional 2 months. So we will continue our engagement efforts and continue to accept comments on the first draft from the public until March 18th, 2022. At that point, and starting now and continuing, we will review those first draft comments and also prepare a red line version of the second draft with revisions as we make them. That second draft now will become a public hearing draft that we anticipate being completed in May 2022 for a public hearing in front of the City Council in June. That same month, we're going to be seeking a planning committee recommendation, and currently we're on target for hopefully an approved adoption of the UDO in July 2022. So a little bit more detail about the UDO. It's broken down into separate topic areas. You can see a few of them there on your screen. Zoning is a big one, certainly stormwater, natural resources. And tonight we're going to spend a little bit time of discussing subdivision, streets, and other infrastructure, or as what we've taken to calling internally here SSI. And in that SSI part of the UDO, which is part 10, it is broken out into 6 separate articles. We have got an introduction article, an article that details the subdivision process, Article 32, which we covered a lot of when we had our first UDO virtual conversation on SSI in December, has to do with network cross-access and driveway regulations. And we also touched a little bit in December, and we will again tonight, on Article 34, standards for streets, off-street public paths and cross-access. And then a very good portion of what our discussion is going to center on this evening has to do with Article 33, which is that required new streets and transportation improvements. And then also important, when we talk about infrastructure and not to be forgotten, we have another article, Article 35, on that other infrastructure, which details things like water supply and wastewater sewer. So with that prefacing and context, I'll now turn the presentation over to our subdivision administrator, Josh Weaver, and he'll walk you through the next couple of slides. Josh.
Thanks, Kevin. So there's 2 basic buckets of streets in the city of Charlotte. There's arterials, and then there's the local and collector streets. Arterials, such as parkways, boulevards, and avenues listed below, range from higher traffic, more auto-oriented, higher volume, higher speed roads like parkways, to main streets that are more direct access, lower speed, lower volume, and more pedestrian-oriented roads. Next slide. So collector and local streets historically have been built through the subdivision process. As development occurs, the developers also build new streets. However, with this change in state law 160D, new streets moving forward with the UDO can also be required through zoning reviews, not just subdivision reviews. Local and collector streets may be required through the subdivision process if a new principal building is being built, or if there's a street corridor shown on the streets map. Next slide. So we went over last time a lot about how new development builds streets and how those street spacings are determined. And those are with preferred and maximum block lengths that are currently in the subdivision ordinance, but are being revised with the UDO. And so currently they're more zoning based, and with the UDO, they'll be more place type based. We've also adjusted those maximum and preferred block lengths for regional activity centers, for manufacturing and logistics. And we've also added preferred and maximum block lengths for parks and preserves with the UDO. So the preferred block lengths, for the most part, are staying very similar to what we have in the current subdivision ordinance. However, regional activity centers, we're actually reducing the preferred block length from 500 to 400. We're finding in manufacturing logistics that the 600 preferred block length is really not realistic. So we're increasing that to 800, and we're adding a 1,000-foot preferred block length in parks and preserves. Next slide. We're also adjusting the maximum block length for local and collector streets, and for the regional activity centers, we're decreasing the maximum from 650 to 600. We're actually increasing the maximum for manufacturing logistics and adding more criteria for when that maximum can be increased. And in parks and preserves, we're increasing that maximum or adding a maximum of 1,500 feet. Tracy, we'll go to you.
Thanks, Josh. Really just to kind of wrap up the information on new streets that Josh has just talked about, wanted to provide a little bit of information about where you find the standards and the information about new streets. I would add to the two buckets that Josh talked about, perhaps a third bucket that's not really streets, but can be roadways that people will think about if they think about what the way they get around the city. And so we've added limited access here. We just want to show where you find the information about these different kinds of streets and roadways. So limited access roadways are shown on the streets map, but are not, that basically just for locational reasons. They're really not, there's no design standards or expectations shown for limited access roadways shown on the streets map for those roadways, excuse me. Arterials, as Josh pointed out, are on the streets map, and the standards are also found on the streets map. And these are streets, like if you look at the drawing in the center at the bottom there, those are the kinds of streets that are sometimes referred to as thoroughfares, the larger streets. Collectors and locals, collectors are on the streets map in some cases, but not in all cases, because there is actually there are criteria in the UDO that define certain streets that might be required as collectors. Locals are not on the streets map at all, except in very, very limited circumstances related to trails. And so the standards for both collectors and locals are found in the Land Development Standards Manual. So this is just really kind of a simple way to look at where you find information about the different types of streets. Next slide, please. So generally what I'm been asked to do tonight is to walk through some information about improvements to existing streets. Josh has talked about, and we talked in December at a meeting like this, about kind of the requirements for new streets. I'm going to focus on the requirements for existing streets, but before I get into that, I want to remind you all that you can also review and provide comments on an important accompaniment to the UDO, and that's the Streets Manual. It supports the UDO and it's out there and under review on the same time frame as the UDO. And so you can go either by using this QR code or the link, go and look at this document, or right now it's actually 3 documents. But you can look at these documents and provide comments. But just briefly, there are 3 components to the Streets Manual. There's some documentation that describes the streets map and the way the streets map is built and the policies that are in it. There is the driveway and access rules portion of the Streets Manual. And what this is essentially our current driveway manual with some refinements to incorporate place types. To basically update that manual to reflect place types, and also to take out the parts that have now been brought into the UDO, and we described those in a meeting like this in December. Probably the biggest piece of the Streets Manual that is different and that folks might want to take a look at is this Comprehensive Transportation Review, or CTR. And this is basically an update, a modernization of our traffic impact studies. And so we have, like other places, we have ways that we work to assess development's impact on the transportation network and ways to mitigate for those impacts. And that's typically has traditionally been looking at traffic and then looking at road widenings to mitigate for that. We've known for some time that we need to update our traffic impact study to better reflect and align with our evolving policies. So if you go to the next slide, please. So just a little bit of a high level comparison, just to kind of show how it is that the CTR better aligns with our policies. On the left, you have our current approach with our traffic impact study, and then on the right, you have the updated approach with the CTR. The current approach is based solely on looking at motor vehicle impacts and cars and traffic. The updated approach, to better align with our policy frameworks, considers all modes. So it's a much more multimodal approach. Our traffic impact study, as I alluded to, was last updated in 2007. Now is the time to modernize those assessments to better align not only with the 2040 policy framework, but a lot of the other policy work that's been done in the interim. For example, Charlotte Walks and Charlotte Bikes, and to make sure that we're better aligning with all of our policies as they exist today. Under the current approach, the traffic impact study would apply to conditional rezoning petitions, and there was also an incorporation of some language in the TOD, the Transit Oriented Development Ordinance, that was adopted in 2019. So that's the current approach. The updated approach will basically broaden to apply to all UDO zoning districts. So it's basically a broader brush, but it's a more context-based brush, which I'll explain in a minute. The current approach is a kind of a one-size-fits-all approach. The answers might not be one-size-fits-all, but the approach is. The updated approach with the CTR is more context-based. It basically reflects the fact that we've got over 300 square miles of a city that has a lot of different contexts in it. And so our way of assessing impacts should reflect the context. Our current approach focuses on negotiated improvements as part of the mitigations. Under the updated approach with the CTR, the process is more predictable, transparent, and consistent. There are menus of options for mitigations, for example, and there are different ways, and there are specific ways you go through the development of the assessment and those mitigations. So we go from a negotiated to a more predictable and transparent process. Next slide, please. Just taking one little further dive into the details, but not very detailed, just to further show how we're aligning our policies or this assessment, the CTR, with our policies. The CTR includes really three types of assessments: a multimodal assessment that really focuses on moving people, not just cars; a transportation demand management, or TDM, assessment that really focuses on reducing single occupant vehicle trips in certain high intensity environments. And then, because we still have to look at the effects of development on traffic and congestion, we also have a traffic impact study element as well in the CTR. We still maintain that. So these three types of assessment allow us then to create context-based, not just the assessments themselves, but the mitigations as well. And the reason we want to do this is we want the outcomes to be appropriate to the context. And so that, again, reflects a better alignment with our policies overall. So, for example, in higher intensity districts and place types, the focus might be more on multimodal and TDM improvements and assessments, whereas in lower intensity districts, you're still going to have a multimodal focus, but you're going to also emphasize vehicular improvements along with, similar to the more traditional TIS. The TIS itself, in terms of any changes to that, again, encourage you to go and look at the details, but we're making an effort to make sure that this is aligning with the NCDOT traffic impact studies so that there's consistency there. And then we've also updated the TIS thresholds to better align with our peer cities and with the needs of our growing city. So what I've tried to do is just kind of give a broad overview of what is in the streets manual and a little bit about the CTR. I do encourage you to go look at the documents, provide your comments. Again, these are on the same review and adoption schedule pretty much as the UDO is. So they're going to be kind of working parallel through this process towards an adoption by council. Next slide, please. So with that, I'm going to change gears a little bit and go to speaking about what's actually in the UDO itself, provide kind of a high-level overview of what happens when development occurs along an existing street and what kinds of transportation-related improvements might be required as part of that development. And specifically, what we're going to look at, what I'm going to walk through, is the rules and regulations regarding curb and gutter, and the rules and regulations regarding streetscape. And just to clarify, when we talk about streetscape, we're talking about the sidewalk, or in some cases, a shared use path. And then when we talk about the planting strip and amenity zone, we're talking about that space between the sidewalk and the street itself that is either going to be planted with grass or hardscaped, and is typically going to include street trees as well. Next slide, please. So before I go into the actual regulations, just a little bit of context, kind of lay the groundwork a little bit. The regulations and the way they're laid out in the UDO are based on melding together the approaches that were developed as part of the transit-oriented development ordinance that was updated in 2019, and existing requirements in current ordinance, such as in chapter 19 of the city of the code, city code, and of our ordinance. So melding those two, the existing requirements with the new approaches, we've done that, and then refined those requirements to reflect context. And specifically, the context is based on place types and street types to make sure that we've got the appropriate regulations for each context. Next, please. So we'll start with curb and gutter on existing streets. And really what we're talking about here is when you've got an existing street and you need to know whether as a development coming in is going to need to do anything with curb and gutter. I'll walk through briefly the standards and dimensions. Then we'll talk about what happens when there is no existing curb and gutter, like the situation on the right side of this street. And then what the rules are about relocating curb and gutter when it does exist, but it might not be in the place that it ultimately needs to be. Next, please. So in terms of standards for curb and gutter, we can really look at two types of standards that are included in the UDO. One is the design for the curb and gutter, and the other is the location of the curb and gutter. And when we talk about design, we basically mean what type of curb does it need to be? Can it be a valley curb? Does it have to be a standard curb? And so forth. And so all of that information is in this chapter that, as Kevin points out, we call SSI for short. So the type is defined, the type that's required or allowed is defined in SSI. The Charlotte Land Development Standards Manual provides the construction details for those. The other standard has to do with the location of the curb itself, the future curb. And so this is important because a lot of the regulations even in other parts of the UDO are tied to that curb location. So for example, setbacks for buildings and so forth. And so it's important that we have a good tool to have it very clear where that exists. And so for arterial streets, for the larger streets, the thoroughfare type streets, sometimes people call them, that information is found on the streets map. So if you look at the little diagram on the bottom left there, you can see that we clearly point out where the back of curb would be, and that makes it easier for folks to apply the UDO. For local and collector streets, those are not necessarily on the streets map. The standards for defining where the curb is and the design for that are found in the cross sections that are located in the Land Development Standards Manual, similar to what's shown on the bottom right here. Next, please. So in terms of whether or not a development that comes in needs to add curb and gutter to an existing street that doesn't have curb and gutter, there are a variety of on-site actions that might trigger that. And so, for example, you have something as large scale as doing a new subdivision. There might be a large expansion. This references change of use or transportation intensive uses. I'll explain that better a little bit later because it's going to pop up in a couple of different places. So it really is scaled to what you're doing on your site. And as with most of the requirements that are in the UDO, there are also exceptions built in. I'm not going to go through each of these exceptions listed here, except to say that the first two are the same as the current ordinance. They're not different. This is basically carrying over from the existing ordinance. I will mention that the funded CIP project, if you're not familiar, basically, there are several modifications and exceptions throughout the UDO that basically say if there's a capital project coming that's going to build that, then you may not have to build it yourself if you're developing, but you might actually pay towards that project. So the first two bullets are basically an ordinance now. The bottom two bullets on NCDOT streets, we've put language in the UDO because NCDOT doesn't always require curb and gutter in the same way, or that in some cases they may not want it. There's language in there to say that CDOT, the Charlotte DOT, will work with NCDOT to determine whether or not it's required. And then lower intensity residential development is exempt from adding curb and gutter. Next, please. So relocating, what happens when you've got curb and gutter, but it's not in the right location? Because again, the streets map for arterials, for example, shows where that future curb and gutter needs to be to provide the kinds of multimodal streets we're building. So this is listed, it's a new concept. It's really more correct to probably say it's an expanded concept, but it's so currently curb might be relocated and rebuilt and moved as a result of a requirement from a traffic impact study. So for example, it might be moved to accommodate a turn lane, maybe through conditional rezonings or other types of plan approvals. There are instances where the curb and gutter would be relocated. So the concept itself is not new. What is new is it's a broader application of the concept, and it is also set up with rules to clarify and to make it more clear when the curb and gutter would be required to be relocated. Now I'll go into a little bit of detail on that, but really want to start by saying, why are we doing this? We're doing this because this provides really more clarity and predictability for how incremental street improvements would occur. It's a more systematic way for us to continue to build out our multimodal street network. And ultimately, along with our capital projects through the CIP, it gets us further along in terms of actually building the multimodal streets that our policies are asking of us, or telling us we need to do. So by moving the curb, we may be able to move and have space for bicycle facilities, or for center space to provide safer turning for motorists or safer crossings for pedestrians, for example. Next, please. So in terms of the applicability of relocating curb and gutter in the UDO, basically, when would this be required as a part of a development? The biggest key in terms of this is an expanded concept, that is, it does apply to by right development. The triggers would apply to all by right development. It doesn't mean that every by right development would do it, but it would be at least looked at. And the triggers themselves and the requirements for whether or not curb and gutter would need to be relocated are scaled, because it can't be one size fits all application of this. So it's really scaled to reflect what the project is doing and the location of that project. And so specifically, we would look, when you look at the language, you go in and look at the language, what it's intended to do is ask the question, is, what are you doing on site? What's happening on site? How much development is occurring? How much change is occurring on the site? And then in addition, you would look at what the context is. What kind of place type is it in? What kind of district is it in? And what's the street type? And so what this means is, if you come in, it's like a sliding scale. If you come in with a large development in a high intensity place type on an arterial, you're more likely to be required to relocate the curb and gutter than if you come in with a small development in a lower intensity place type and on a collector street, for example. We also look at how much street frontage is affected. If you look at the UDO, we have a tool in there that is block length, that is context based. And so we look at how much of a street frontage or a block frontage is affected by the development to make sure that it's appropriate to move the curb at this point. Next, please. So even with those rules in place, that kind of sliding scale to look at the triggers and see where it makes sense to require the curb and gutter being moved, there are still, it's recognized that there are case-by-case circumstances or some unique circumstances where even those rules may not apply. So there are exceptions and modifications built in. Again, I'm not going to necessarily go through each one of these. If you can look, if you have specific questions, you can ask about it. But the exceptions are for things as varied as preserving heritage trees or large stands of trees that could be affected by moving the curb. Moving the curb could have a stormwater or a drainage related issue that could not be designed out of, or could become worsened. And so we would want to try to fix that. If it can't be, then obviously there's an exception for that. The key to all of this in terms of the exceptions and modification is that even if the curb is not required to be relocated, that doesn't override that future curb location. It simply says that in the interim, that curb doesn't have to move. It's not going to be required to be moved, but all of the other details that are measured from that future curb location are maintained. Next, please. Okay, so that's the situation and the information about curb and gutter. Now we'll talk about streetscape. And again, what we'll talk about here is use a similar approach. We'll talk about standards and dimensions, and then quickly talk about what happens when there is no existing streetscape, like the bottom two left pictures here on existing streets, where there needs to be appropriate requirements for adding the streetscape. And then also what happens and what triggers the need to update streetscape when it is substandard. Sorry, I have an audience. It's not enjoying this. Could you go back for just a second? So updating the streetscape would happen when you have a substandard situation like that on the right, where you have a sidewalk at the back of curb. Next slide, please. Thanks, Kevin. First, standards and dimensions. This first statement probably sounds a little strange, always behind the future back of curb. But again, this goes to what I just said about the location of the future back of curb. It's set up so that no matter whether the curb moves or not, the streetscape will be put in the right location for the future. The sidewalk widths are context-based. If you can see this table, you look at street type and whether it's a lower intensity place or a higher intensity place, and you can see a variety of different widths that are based on that context. So for example, in a lower intensity place on most arterials, you're going to have either a 6-foot minimum sidewalk, or in some cases, a shared use path. In a higher intensity place, you'd have an 8-foot sidewalk, or in rare instances, a shared use path. They're somewhat less appropriate in high intensity places. A main street, as Josh pointed out, this is a special kind of street. This is our most pedestrian oriented arterial type street on the streets map, and the sidewalk width would be 10 feet there. I think a key thing is that citywide, the UDO is now referencing a 6-foot minimum sidewalk width. So if you look at locals and collectors, depending on the intensity of the place type, they're typically going to be 6 or 8-foot sidewalks. And that's different. Current ordinance allows for 5-foot sidewalks in some circumstances. The planting strip or amenity zone, again, that space between the sidewalk and the street, has a standard dimension of 8 feet. That's typical. There is some variation for certain reasons, but for the most part, we're talking about an 8-foot dimension, which to support street trees and to provide good buffer. And whether or not that is a planting strip, which means grass and street trees, or a more hardscaped amenity zone with street trees, is really based on what kind of place you're in and whether or not there's on-street parking next to that sidewalk. Next, please. So in terms of applicability of streetscape, this is not broken out by whether or not you're adding or whether or not you're updating streetscape. It's just to say that there is a broad range of actions that occur on site that could trigger whether or not you would either add a sidewalk or update a substandard sidewalk. And so those range from, doing a subdivision to building a new principal structure. Both of those would apply to either adding or updating a sidewalk. The other items here are kind of as a sliding scale of what are you doing on the site, and are you missing a sidewalk totally, or do you have a substandard sidewalk? So I won't necessarily go into that, except to say these are the things that might trigger the need to add streetscape or improve it. The exceptions here, most development in the N1 place type is exempt from the streetscape standards. Most existing development is exempt from this. Next, please. In a couple of places, there's been a reference to transportation intensive uses as a trigger that might create the need to either move the curb and gutter or add a sidewalk or update a sidewalk. That's a new concept. And I just want to spend a little second here and explain that. As a trigger, it's typically going to be referenced in the UDO as change of use or a change to a transportation intensive use. Change of use in the UDO is defined as a change from one major land use category to another. So the example here is an industrial category to a commercial category. And that can mean something for certain types of requirements. But from the standpoint of streetscape and what's happening on the street, it doesn't really account for significant changes within one of those categories. So for example, you could have in the commercial category a car repair facility that transitions over time and changes to a restaurant or a bar, for example. And so that has a very different impact, even though it's within the same category of use. It has a very different impact on how the street is used and the need for multimodal streets. And so this idea of transportation intensive uses is that the UDO spells out some specific uses that if you change to it, it counts similar to a change of use. Next, please. So we talked a little bit about adding sidewalk where it doesn't currently exist. And there's also provision for updating substandard sidewalk and streetscape. And this is a hybrid of some existing ordinance. In chapter 19 of the current ordinance and in the TOD ordinance that was adopted in 2019, there's approaches and regulations about updating substandard streetscape. It has been refined for the UDO to reflect all place types because it really needs to apply across the city and for all places, place types and all uses. And so again, this is in terms of whether or not this is triggered is kind of a sliding scale. It depends on what's happening on the site, how intensive the development is on the site, and how substandard the sidewalk is. So this requirement would be triggered if either the sidewalk or the planting strip is substandard. And so we've got a definition of how the UDO defines substandard for streetscape here, not to go into the weeds on this, but just to show that one way to make this reflect all place types is to say, if the sidewalk or the shared use path is not within 2 feet of the standard width, then it needs to be updated. If you have met those other triggers. And the planting strip, since planting strips are expected to be 8 feet, if they're less than 6 feet, that counts as a substandard streetscape as well. Next slide, please. Finally, just to kind of wrap up streetscape, whether you're adding sidewalks and streetscape or whether you're updating it, as with the other regulations, there are modifications to the standards or in some case the requirement overall for a variety of reasons, case by case. A couple of key things that we've tried to provide, that the UDO provides more specific guidance on, has to do with tree preservation and constrained space. So in places where there are heritage trees or large stands of mature trees, the streetscape exactly as dimensioned and sidewalk exactly as located may not work as well. We can preserve some trees potentially, but we need to provide information about if you can't do the standard, then how do you best find an alternative location that still meets the intent? Similar, the constrained space guidance. If you look at the photo on the right, let's say you want to reuse an existing building, the building's not going to move, but there's not space for the standard streetscape. There's specific step-by-step information in the UDO about how to allocate the space to get a streetscape that works best within that constrained space. Next, please. So as I've walked through, I've tried to point out, I think by virtue of kind of the way the triggers are set up for requirements, by virtue of the exceptions that are built in and some of the opportunities for modification, there's a fair amount of flexibility built into the requirements. There is also a section in this section of the UDO called transportation adjustments. And what that does is it spells out that some of those standards may be adjusted as well if it is determined that the standard, that it needs to be adjusted to be more proportional to what's happening and what's being, to the impact of the development. And so there is this section that allows some flexibility. It's limited only to make the standard more related to or more proportional to the impacts. This would be, there's a table in there that tells what those standards are. It identifies which director of which department makes that decision, and then any appeals to that would go to a board of adjustment. And I think that that's the last slide that I was going to go through. I'll hand this over to John Howard with CATS.
Yes, thank you, Tracy. So I'm going to go through a couple of slides here about bus stop requirements within the UDO. And of course, similar to what Tracy was talking about with CDOT, this is to maintain and improve access to CAT services for existing substandard, if you will, bus stops, and also for new bus stops that goes with new development. So the picture on the top right, you can see there is a stop, but there's no sidewalk. There's no ramp for ADA. So any existing stops that are adjacent to a proposed development would need to be upgraded to an ADA compliant bus stop. And same goes for any new bus stops for non-residential, mixed-use, multifamily, or townhouse developments. We would ask for some type of bus stop amenity along that route as well. If that route's located on the MTC adopted transit service plan or existing route, and also if it meets a minimum number of daily trips. We work with CDOT on that as well to come up with that number. And a stop's not required if there's already an existing stop within about a quarter mile on the same side of the street. So that 1,320 feet is about a quarter mile. So in that situation, we would not require another bus stop. And any new stop or amenity must be designed to CAT standards, and those can be found in the Charlotte Land Development Manual. And for any private bus stops, they would also have to be reviewed by CATs. So on the bottom right, you'll see kind of a typical situation where you have a ADA compliant ramp and pad behind the curb. And in this situation, there's also room for a trash receptacle. Then you have your sidewalk, and then you have a concrete pad for a shelter and perhaps a bike rack. Not all situations will require all of these things. It depends, of course, on the physical space that's allowed, the development density to see if the shelter would make sense. Otherwise, in most situations, it would just be the concrete bus waiting pad behind the curb. And the same goes for any kind of non-CATS bus stops and amenities. Again, the same rules would apply. And again, exceptions to those improvements would be steep slopes where you don't have the space behind the curb to put anything in. If there's any kind of intersection or driveway conflicts, and also overall, if there's any kind of unsafe conditions for transit system operators, drivers, and pedestrians and bicyclists. So those are your exceptions for the most part. And these standards are kind of what we're already requiring through rezoning or through land development. So it's not too dissimilar from what we're already requiring. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Kevin.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Tracy. Thank you, Josh. Thank you, all of our presenters this evening. I appreciate it. Couple of slides here towards the end of our presentation where I'm going to kind of let people know about some of the valuable resources that we have out there for you to engage with this UDO project and to provide your input. The first, I want to give a plug to all our public engagement team members on the UDO team is our UDO website. That can be visited at www.charlotteudo.org. From there, you can access the complete first public draft of the UDO, as well as link to the online portal, which will allow you to submit comments and questions about that draft. Also on our UDO website, you'll find other valuable information such as information pertaining to schedules, upcoming meetings, some important supporting reference documents that are mentioned in the UDO, as well as some frequently asked questions and their answers and more. Also, we have, because we understand that looking through a 608-page development ordinance can be difficult, even for us internally, we have crafted a handy dandy 26-page reference guide that is also available online and can be accessed through the helpful resources tab of the UDO website. This is meant to be an easy to understand guide that walks you through the first public draft and to help you locate specific information in the larger draft, as well as focus you on some specific topics of interest, whether it be development, language, or zoning district related. And it also provides a brief summary of some of the new regulatory concepts that the city has put forth as part of the Unified Development Ordinance, including residential overlays, parking tiers, tree preservation, and topically for what we're reviewing tonight, some transportation improvements. Just some quick hits on the UDO first draft. Again, that was released in October 2021. Community engagement pretty much started straight away in October and is continuing now, and will continue as we accept public comments for an extended period of time now through March 18th. And again, just redirecting you for all your UDO needs, feel free to visit the website at charlotteudo.org. And just a brief plug out there for our ongoing virtual conversations. As you can see by this flyer, this was the last one scheduled for this phase of virtual conversations. However, I'd like to point out that we had a virtual conversation that was originally scheduled for earlier this month on January 4th that was for frequent users and their questions. We had to reschedule that to January 27th, so that is still yet forthcoming. I would encourage you, if you're interested in attending that session, that you, as you did for this session, register for that using the QR code here on the flyer or visiting the Charlotte UDO website to get that registration information. These conversations, as you can see through the schedule, very much focused on specific topic areas. The one that has been rescheduled from January 4th to the 27th will focus kind of on those practitioners in the field of development ordinances and how they apply this in their daily work and maybe some of the questions that they have. That conversation will also be 1 hour in length, scheduled twice during the 27th, one from noon to 1 p.m. and a later session at 6 to 7 p.m. And with that, that concludes this evening's presentation. And with that, I am happy to visit the chat to see if we've got anything that we need to circle back and revisit. I'm not seeing anything more recent than GQ Lewis's request for the streets manual information. We've got just a little bit of time remaining before 7 o'clock. Maybe let's pause here for, I see, I knew if I paused that somebody would raise a question. I appreciate it, Katie. Thank you. So Katie has submitted a question. Her question, I've read that the state legislature wants to implement a ban on local stormwater runoff regulations if they exceed state or federal standards. Has this happened? And could this mean a degraded water quality? What guidance did you use for stormwater regulations? Can the state step in and undo our plans? Those are really great questions. Robbie, I see that you're still with us. Robbie Zink with the city would probably be best positioned to speak to this. Robbie, are you able to unmute and shed any light on Katie's questions?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, so yes, a couple of years ago, the state legislature did pass some legislation that makes this where our ordinance really can't be any more strict than the state's. So we are operating under that now. Well, listen, they kind of did. And then it's probably not fully implemented. And we kind of wonder if that will come back. They did do away with some of the things that we have done in the past. That's kind of why I was answering that originally. The big thing they really did is as a part of our post-construction stormwater ordinance, we made people treat or mitigate for existing impervious area that they were essentially removing and replacing through redevelopment. The state did do away with that back in 2018. There was some state legislation last year that I believe it did not pass that basically would have made our ordinance the same as the state's. We couldn't go any stricter. That, to my knowledge, did not pass, but similar language kind of gets brought up every year. So in a way, to me, it wouldn't surprise me if it does happen. We've tried to make some changes through the UDO to kind of help with water quality issues since we did lose that redevelopment provision. So some lower triggers. If you want more information, if you can get my contact information, I'm sorry, but I'm kind of on the road right now trying to fill in this. But we did make some changes in the UDO. Hopefully those make it through to help with our water quality and flooding issues that we already have in the city.
Thank you, Robbie. I appreciate you shedding light on Katie's question. And, I would just say, Katie, that much like you're seemingly up to date or cognizant of the discussions at the state level, our staff continually is so. And as you heard from Robbie, they've been tracking this thing for a couple of years now. And, they will remain cognizant and tracking of it because much like you said, they've got to always be aware of potential impacts for what our local regulations are. But at the same time, they're also trying to be adaptable to some of the constraints that state legislation may place on us to regulate locally as well. See a couple of more questions. Seems that these are having to do with the links for the virtual conversation series. And as Yolanda has indicated, these are available. Probably the ones very early on, I believe, have already been posted. The ones that have happened here more recently, last Thursday, we had a discussion on parking, landscaping, and open space, and certainly this evening's. They may not yet be uploaded and found online, but they should be forthcoming at those links that Yolanda has put in the chat. So with that, it basically brings us to the conclusion of our discussion this evening. I want to share my appreciation and gratitude for everybody that has spent some of your time this evening to kind of listen to us and have a discussion and engage with you with regard to our project. And just one last plug for the UDO website. Feel free, www.charlotteudo.org. Feel free to reach out to read that draft, make comments, leave questions, or contact the UDO staff. So thank you, and I hope you all have a good rest of your evening. Bye now.